Okay, everyone, so we'll get started, shall we? First of all, thanks for coming on. Thank you to all the panellists and the presenters for putting the work together and reading the papers in a lot of detail. I think it's going to be a really good one. This is the third one of the series so far, and I think it's really caught traction, something that I wouldn't actually think it would have done so much when I first came up with the idea, probably at the start of lockdown, really. So again, thank you to all for tuning in repeatedly over time, and hopefully it's another good episode that people enjoy. So first of all, I just wanted to give a little bit of a recap, so where we've been and what we've done so far. So in the first one, we had Dr. Harry Routledge, we had Kevin Shattock, who's a PhD researcher at Leeds Beckett, and he did his talk on auto-regulation resistance training, and Harry on muscle glycogen utilisation, how it can be measured with ultrasound. And then we had Professor Barry Drust, who came on to speak about a very current paper with regards to the congested fixture period in an elite team from France. And it was actually probably one of the only papers and one of the main papers that I know that the Premier League are using at the moment in order to design the schedule when teams start returning. Then we went to the second one, and we had Dr. Kelly Hammond, who presented some of her research on low carbohydrate training and the impact that has on bone turnover and muscle glycogen usage, and also the signaling effects. Then we had Dr. Sean McLaren come on. He came on and he spoke about some of his research, which he did on response to differential RPE. And then to finish on that one, we had Professor Graham Close, and he presented one of his review articles, which he's made on Paper to Podium, and it's a framework on how to grade different research articles depending on some of what they fall into. Then we finished up with a roundtable, and Graham was part of that roundtable with Dr. John Bartlett. We then had Dr. Steve Barrett, Chris Barnes, and Professor Stuart Bruce Lowe. We discussed some sort of high performance research in the sporting environment and how we can try and move that on going forward, really. And that's ultimately came up with, I wanted to create a vision for the Journal Club and how that works and how that's going to work going forward. And ultimately, I wanted to create an online video platform for journal articles to be disseminated in order to develop knowledge. Then I wanted to provide people from multiple disciplines a greater understanding of the research process. And then I wanted to serve as a resource to generate research ideas and also collaborations. Now I'll get started with this one really and sort of go through the agenda. First on, we've got Marcus Hannon, then we've got up Elliot Hall, then Dr. Stacey Emmonds, and then a post-event discussion will take place between all the panelists, and that's more of an informal talk for people to be involved and enjoy. I'd also just like to introduce today's panel. Thank you very much. I'm sure you've read all the articles in a lot of detail.
So yeah, just to start, thanks Liam for having me on, and looking forward to presenting this and also hearing from the other guys. So I'm just going to give an overview of this paper, how it came about, and a bit of context to the background of kind of where it fitted into my PhD. So it's an injury audit in high-level male youth soccer players from English, Spanish, Uruguayan and Brazilian academies. So when we're thinking about injuries, the main key thing to introduce is the injury prevention model. And I've used the Van Mechelen version, which we adopted, but the stages are very similar. So at the start, the first stage is to quantify the problem, in this case, injury, followed by establishing risk factors, which will allow you to design and implement preventative measures. And then you assess how effective they were by repeating the first step. Now, if you take that out of the context of injury, it's quite similar to a lot of sports science models in that a baseline measurement, for example, VO2 max, contributing factors, exercise type, time, intensity, duration, etc. with a combination of those, you can have an intervention. Then again, you repeat that to see how effective your intervention has been. So in my PhD was to look at the epidemiology of injuries in youth soccer players, with particular reference to 3 different risk factors. So in football, anyone that watches the sport or any sport will recognise that injuries are a problem. It's the single major factor influencing player availability, and in some older youth studies, it indicates that 6 to 11% of youth players' development time is lost due to injury. So if I did a bit of quick maths, and that works out at the top end, roughly 30 days per season per player. And if you extrapolate that over 10 seasons, players can miss more than the equivalent of a whole season. When I was collecting data for my PhD, a quote I heard from one of the Spanish staff, which is very simple, but it's very effective, was that skill and availability equals great players. So without player availability, no matter how good the player is, their development and their contribution to the team is very limited. And we also know that injury risk is increased a lot by having a previous injury. So in players who are developing, having a previous injury is highly detrimental. So in the context of my PhD, we were already at step 2, and we had, based on previous literature, identified 3 risk factors which we wanted to look at. There was absolutely nothing wrong with that, but within our discussions, we actually worked out, you know what, we need to know a bit more about the injury data we've got, and we need to see if the injuries we're looking at are actually a problem in our cohort. So this injury audit wasn't actually in the original PhD plan, but it became A, a plan for a descriptive chapter, and then B, it actually materialized into a manuscript, in that we were able to quantify the problem and actually, I believe, give a bit more, make the process a bit more scientifically robust in what we were going to look at. And the key question really is, which injury have the greatest impact on availability in youth soccer? So onto the methods. Participants in study period. Very, very fortunate for this study and my PhD to have 8 participating academies across 4 different countries. We had 624 players registered that we utilised in this study, and we looked at a single season. We actually had up to 6 and 7 seasons for some players, but it's very difficult to compare players who you've only got a single season with players who you've got multiple, because it's not an even comparison. So we went with a single season for our injury audit. Key variables in any injury audit are to look at the type of injury, which is mainly the tissue, and the location on the body. The biggest impact on player availability is the days that are missed, so the days that the players can't train or they can't play in matches. We also had different countries, and we recognised that that was quite a novel factor, in that many studies before have been done in separate countries, but not actually within the same investigation. So we wanted to compare and see if there was any difference, because when we looked at later chapters in the risk factors, we would have to work out, actually, should we account for country as well? It's always useful to look at different age groups, because players across different age groups, as well as within the same age groups, are very different. We also wanted to look at seasonal variation, so the differences across the months of the season. So if we put that all together, what did we get? So in terms of number of injuries, I'll present it as a whole cohort. We had 443 injuries, 40% of players in the study being injured once or more. 58.5% were non-contact. In terms of the injury types, muscle, ligament and growth related were our 3 most common, closely followed by hematomas, bruises, contusions, but those are most likely to be contact injuries and arguably less preventable. So if you group muscle, ligament and tendon together as soft tissue, they accounted for more than half of the injuries which were in the study, and more than a third of the injuries were non-contact injuries to those tissues. In terms of location, unsurprisingly, the majority were to the lower limbs, and that's in agreement with all previous literature in this population and adult players. Specifically the thigh, including hamstrings and quadriceps, the knee and the ankle. Much more interesting though, if we look at this by age group, and a bit of context to this as well, this table wasn't in the initial manuscript, so when this went in for review, one of the reviewers gave quite a constructive comment and said it'd be interesting to know by player age group which were the most common types and locations. So that A, indicated to us something we'd maybe overlooked in the research process, and B, the process of peer review, in my opinion, has actually improved this manuscript. So if we interrogate this data a little bit more, which actually hasn't been done in the manuscript, growth-related injuries, as you might expect, are more common in the younger age groups, up till about under 14. And muscle injuries start to become a problem at under 13 and are the most common injury from there on, which may be coincidental, but probably very much linked to the thigh being the most common injury location in older players. Indeed, 11.5% of all injuries we recorded were to the hamstrings. Ligament injuries were common across all age groups, so they're always in the top 3. But we also saw this little trend of kind of lower back and pelvic injuries in the younger age groups, who were also the age groups where growth seemed to be a problem in terms of injuries. So potentially something there for some further investigation. In terms of injury severity, I believe this slide itself probably gives the biggest explanation of the problem of injuries in youth football. So 12,143 days were lost in total to injuries over the one season. So I did a bit of quick maths, that's over 33 years if you add them all up. If you divide it by the number of players, it's about 20 days per player per injury, an average of 4 weeks, although there's a big variation, anywhere from a single day up to just above 300. Nearly 3/4 required more than a week before players were considered fit enough to be available for selection again. And nearly 30% required around about a month. Once more though, if we investigate that by age group, then it becomes a little bit more interesting. So towards the right-hand side of the screen, the proportion of the bars occupied in black is the proportion of injuries per age group that were severe, so requiring 4 weeks or more. Under 14s and under 16s had a significantly greater proportion compared to other age groups of severe injuries. Under 15s weren't a million miles off, but it wasn't a statistically significant difference. So is that related to maturation, which we'll come back to? The other variables we looked at, there was small differences between countries. We saw tendon injury rate was higher in Brazil than Spain. Our Brazilian players were all older. There was no younger players in that cohort, and there was also a small number of tendon injuries, so potentially needs a little bit more research on that area, and a higher amount of lower back injuries in Spain, which again, it's not apparent why that was the case. If you look at seasonal variation, that differed not only between countries, but between clubs. So when you actually break it down, there wasn't really much of a consistent pattern. Before I talk about practical applications, really important to kind of acknowledge some limitations in the study. Firstly, we only looked at male players, so do we know how applicable these findings are to the female football player? No, and we need to do that investigation. Exposure data, so we didn't quantify and we didn't report differences in the amount of time players are spent training, playing games, doing other complementary training, strength and conditioning, etc. So understanding that will give us more context to these differences that were observed. We had 5 English teams and 1 team from every other nation. So actually, are our differences representative of national differences, or is it only because there's differences between clubs and they could be from anywhere? So to correct that, we'd need more non-English teams in a future replication of this study. We had a lot more players above the age of 16, which I believe reflects being slightly more straightforward to get consent for research from older participants, because you can chat to them kind of on the spot and describe things, whereas it's often the case where you have to kind of go in a few times for the younger age group and speak to parents on different training nights, etc., before consent forms start coming back. And in trying to control for some variables by including 1 season, we've also reduced our ability to then actually see how injuries vary across consecutive years, and actually whether any injuries were re-injuries from previous injuries, which we recognise as being a risk factor. So who could this be useful for? Well, medical team, so doctors, physios, sports therapists, you can have player welfare, psychology in there, coaching staff, S&C coach, nutritionist, and obviously the communication between all these, hopefully, ultimately is for the benefit of the player. Selfishly, for ourselves as researchers, I believe our research process was improved by quantifying what the problem was at the start before we even tried to address it. Practical applications, so if I was to kind of sum things up for the practitioners that are on the line would be injury type. Muscle injuries start to become more common after under 13s. Expect ligament injuries across all ages, and really look out for growth-related injuries in players at under 14s and below. For injury location, the thigh, knee and the ankle are the most common if you consider players together for all age groups. But there's this potential lower back, pelvic injury issue in under 15s and below, and is that related to growth? And thigh injuries start to become more common in hamstrings, particularly in under 15s and above. In terms of absence, 3 in 4 injuries require more than a week. 1 in 4 is requiring more than 4 weeks. So I've said here additional player support. For a lot of young players, football is their life. So if they're going to be out for 4 weeks or more, potentially months, do they need more support to psychological support from missing training and being around their teammates? Do they need support to maintain their cardiovascular fitness, their muscle mass, their muscle strength from strength conditioning department? That can be supported by nutritional strategies to maintain muscle mass and kind of maintain favourable body composition. But also we're coming back again to this influence of maturation. So what I mean by that, I've kind of pinched this graphic here from a PhD. So in brief, from left to right, you've got younger players all the way through the academy journey to the older players, and they're growing physically all through in the process of biological maturation. In this box in the middle, we have what's called peak height velocity, and that refers to a point in that growth where the rate of growth is much sharper than at any other point. Now that usually occurs at around 13.8 years, but as is depicted here, it can happen as early as 12 and as late as 15 and 16. So it means within the same age group, you can have players who are very, very different in size despite their birth certificate saying exactly the same date. Now, there can also be problems related to the changes in muscle and bones at different times. So we really need to investigate that a bit further, particularly because in our study, we identified that the more severe injuries were happening around this point. Now, is that because of the things I've just mentioned, or are coaches already aware of it and they're giving players longer to recover? We need to find out. In terms of academy nationality, if you're going to work somewhere else with different players from different countries, probably wouldn't expect too much difference in the injuries you'll be dealing with, but we need more research. In terms of seasonal variance as well, we didn't see any really distinct pattern, but I would suggest obviously be aware of periods after rest and off-season, deconditioning, but that every academy may be different. Also, just like to give a little bit of reflection on the process. It's good to look back kind of after you've reached the final hurdle, which is publication. So I would say that quantifying the problem isn't always complicated, but it is important, so much to the fact that we overlooked it, and then we actually realised that it would have been a real addition to the thesis and the research process to do it. Aim for the best with the data that you've got available, but accept that it won't be perfect. And in relation to that, learn from the limitations. So I've learned how I would do things differently in this study in the future. And hopefully anybody that's listening that would like to do a similar study takes things that we didn't do and actually controls for them as much as you can. And last but not least, teamwork and collaboration in a study of any kind, but certainly with this amount of clubs and players, is massively important. So I'd just like to thank my supervisory team and all participating academies, players, staff, as well as parents and guardians for kind of giving their kids permission to take part. So thanks for listening. If anyone does want to kind of reach out directly, then my Twitter and my email are on there. I'll be happy to kind of converse with anyone who wishes.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions for Elliot?
Yeah, I've got one. So Elliot, you mentioned a few times about maturation, and obviously at the start you mentioned about this being sort of stage 1 of a 4-stage process. Can you go into any more detail about those other studies?
Yeah, go for it, mate.
Yeah, so the next study after this, coincidentally, was looking at the influence of maturation status on, so basically using this injury audit to actually give us a framework of where we should look and what were the most common injuries. Then we looked back with respect of other risk factors. So the next one is to look at maturation status. Following that, we looked at playing position. And then I guess the real big one that took arguably the most work is to look at the influence of genetic variation on injuries. And that involved getting samples from every single player, a lot of lab work, etc. So that's how the thesis progressed after this study.
And because I'm doing my PhD in a similar area, so quite selfishly on my part, but what did you find in terms of maturity status?
We actually found that the problem of injury, we found it, which was contrary to what a lot of studies that I read would kind of suggest. We found the bigger problem in the older players. Now there could be a lot of reasons for that, but it's in peer review just now, so we're not kind of sure what's going to be put out there. But yeah, we definitely found that the players who we classed as post-peak height velocity injuries seem to be a bit more of a problem than the other age groups. Not to say that it isn't a problem in the other age groups, it just appeared to be more of a problem in the older players.
Okay, thanks, Elliot.
No worries.
Hi, Elliot.
I think one question from me, mate, is obviously, was there any, like... Sorry, go for it all.
Go on, sorry, cheers, Liam. Just a quick one. Really good, Elliot. Thanks for the really detailed presentation. I guess from me, from a practitioner's point of view, it'd probably be really informative. I know you've got areas of injuries. Did you get much information on types of injuries? So if it was an ankle, was it an ankle sprain, syndesmosis? Did you get that much type of information? Or in terms of one of the question and answers here was about pars fractures and spondylitis. Did you get any of that type of information that gives you a bit more of an indication of maybe how these injuries occurred?
Yeah, we had it for not all, but a proportion of the injuries. So we thought rather than kind of report some with much more specific detail than others, we've not gone that much into detail on this particular publication. But for a large proportion of the injuries, we do have a bit more. But it was just kind of injury reporting differences dictated that as it came in.
Yeah, I can imagine it's especially across different nations. I'm sure, as you mentioned in the paper as well, the difficulties of reporting as well. Did you get any information? I guess this answers this a little bit as well. But in terms of like training methodology or periodization, so did you get any idea on things like consecutive days or hours of training or S&C support? Did you get any of that type of information? I'm probably more concerned or probably more inquisitive about away from the UK, more about Brazil and Uruguay.
Yeah, no, we didn't include that, and I spoke to Liam about this as well, and it would be, although that to even just get the amount of hours they're doing each things, or even the days they're training compared to UK academies, that would tell us probably more than we already know, even though it's maybe quite a simple variable. So no, we didn't have that. But I think if you were to do that sort of research, it wouldn't really be that taxing to get that kind of information, and it would be really useful.
Yeah, I think it'd be really useful. And like, as you rightly said, exposure hours and then going down injury incidents per 1,000 hours, injury burden as well. I think that as a practitioner standpoint would be really interesting. Also in terms of working out injury incidents and comparison between training and matches. I know that's kind of done to death a little bit. And even in your paper, you kind of give an indication to percentages of when injuries occurred. And you can sort of see that, I think, was it matches to about 40% of injuries occurred. Obviously matches probably or will attribute to a lot less of the training hours in total. So you'd probably argue that matches come with a greater risk of injuries, which I guess we already know, but it would be really nice as a comparison, wouldn't it, I think, between different nations.
Yeah, I think it would, because obviously training time and exposure, it can increase injury risk, like the more time. So obviously there's more time spent training, but actually the kind of intensity, etc., of training can be a bit more controlled than matches. So yeah, although matches are less, it would be good to compare, and whether training practices and intensities or even times are different between countries, and make players more or less robust.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Elliot. Thanks for that.
Thanks, Ollie. Cheers.
Yeah, no, I think I think Ollie alluded to what I was going to say then, Elliot. We discussed it a few days ago, didn't we, about how we feel like the training load. We need to give some sort of idea, and not even just necessarily the training structure of the different academies and how they're set up. Because, like in England, a lot of people, they do go even different from coaches to coaches. Now, I imagine if you travel across countries, it'd be brilliant. Maybe some more clubs from those European clubs probably, and just seeing the difference, what it is from England like this thing.
Yeah, I fully agree, mate, and I think like what this study demonstrates as well, and there'll be a lot more people on the line who've got different contacts, but forget that sort of information. All it takes is maybe one person with the permission of the club to share a very basic training schedule, and then actually a quite descriptive and useful study for practice across countries and continents can be done. So certainly something to investigate.
All right, to jump in there as well, then.
Definitely, and I think even. Sorry, does someone say something then?
Mark, to jump in, can you?
Yeah, go for it, mate.
Yeah, thanks for that, Elliot. That was a great breakdown. I was the same as Liam and Ollie, to be honest. I was going to ask more around the periodization side of things. The other one I had was kind of more curiosity around what kind of variation, if any, were you seeing in terms of injury type and location between the different countries?
So the main differences we saw, I think I'll just get the slide. So the actual we did it by injury rate, so there wasn't really too many differences at all in what we saw. And the ones which I reported as being different in terms of tendon being higher in Brazil than Spain, there was a really low number of tendon injuries. So whilst there was a difference, how much confidence I have due to the low numbers of injuries that actually were recorded is maybe limited, which is why we would need more teams and certainly more seasons to actually to kind of make those comparisons. Because once you start dividing down by injury types, the actual sample size you've got, even if it's in the hundreds, becomes much smaller.
Where do you see this research going, Elliot, in the future?
I don't really know. I mean, in all honesty, it's not what I'm working on at the moment because my postdoc's very different. But I would like to see it progress into, I don't know, some sort of just basic level collaboration between practitioners in a lot of countries who can share the variables which you guys have just suggested in relation to how much activity and what type of activity players are doing across different age groups and then across different countries. And are there patterns where some countries are producing players who are more robust to injury, to use kind of an overused term, or is it actually kind of down to something else? Is it more related to maturation and not actually where the player is from and how they're trained? Mm-hmm. So I think you've got to, although it's very difficult, you've got to try and incorporate as many of these variables into one study as you can. But then how much of it is actually real life? If you're controlling for a lot of variables statistically, like how much of that is overly controlling it and kind of is it applicable to the real world? But it might help you understand.
Yeah, definitely good. Does anyone else have any questions, or does anyone? If anyone, by the way, in the attendees has any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to them. I think I've got one here, mate. One sec. This is one from Joe Fortescue. Elliot, you mentioned around injuries occurring around maturation and injuries. Did you take anything into account around the interventions in place for each age group? Not too sure what you mean by that one, John, to be honest.
What do you mean by interventions? Is that like kind of, do you mean like any biobanding or kind of
I think that's what you might mean, mate, is the biobanding or how players, when you're going through maturations, anything. So, for example, if a player's going through peak height velocity and they might have been removed from training, for example.
Yeah, we didn't take anything into account. This was just as I mentioned before, actually, the initial purpose of this was just to have a descriptive chapter in the PhD to discuss that injury was a problem and justify what we were looking at. So if, like you asked me the other day, if we were to do this study again and actually from the start want to do specifically an injury audit, then it would account for all these variables and definitely work out, look, does your academy adopt biobanding? What do you do when a player's really close to peak height velocity based on kind of your calculations? Do you do anything? And does that have any effect on that age group?
Yeah, good. And then there's another one on from Michael Green, but I think we've pretty much answered that. And he asked us, did you look at what sort of injury prevention strategies different clubs have in place, and how were they varied?
No, we didn't look at injury prevention as such, and I guess that comes down under the same umbrella as what we talked about in terms of training different types and different volumes. So does that come under the S&C preventative work, and where does it fit in, and how much do they do? And then again, does that differ between countries? Because these are all questions which I imagine are really useful to applied practice.
Yeah. Good. Does anyone else have any questions for the panel? Brilliant. Marcus, can you hear me now?
Yes, mate. Can you hear me?
Yeah, good to have you on, mate. Finally got you. Marcus Hannon. Marcus is the head of nutrition at Aston Villa, and he did his study whilst he was working at Everton Academy on the cross-sectional comparison of body composition in their players throughout each, and the RMR values throughout each player in the academy, ranging from, I think, is it under 12s, Marcus?
Yeah, under 12s all the way through to under 23s, mate.
Yeah, so Marcus, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, mate.
Right, Liam. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. It's great to be able to share some of the data that I've collected. Again, similar to Elliot, as part of my PhD. And again, thanks for organising what's been a great, journal club series so far. So today I'm just going to present some data from a paper that was published back in January in the Journal of Sports Sciences. And this is a first study of a series of studies which was really investigating the energy requirements of academy footballers. And these series of studies, was my PhD, which, as you've just said, Liam, was done in collaboration between Everton Football Club and Liverpool John Moores University. So I guess going into this study and the available literature that was out there, there was a lack of accurate data describing or quantifying the energy requirements of academy footballers in particular. Now, there was a number of studies that had looked at estimated energy requirements using various different methods such as prediction equations and accelerometer activity diaries, which were a good starting point. But as I said, there was no accurate information directly assessing the different components of energy expenditure. Now, if we don't know what an individual or an athlete or a type of athlete is expending, it's very difficult for us as a practitioner to know exactly what to be putting on their plate. Now, that's on a meal-by-meal basis and on a day-by-day basis. So I guess in quantifying the energy expenditure and energy requirements, it will allow us to start to develop population-specific guidelines for Premier League academy footballers in this case. So just to remind everyone of the different components of energy expenditure. Now, it's broken up into three different parts. We have the resting metabolic rate, which is the amount of energy required at rest to maintain homeostatic physiological function. And in most people, this is the largest component of energy expenditure. We have the thermic effect of food, which is also known as diet-induced thermogenesis. And this is the amount of energy required to digest and break down and transport food around the body. And then we have activity energy expenditure. And in athletic populations, this is often the largest component of energy expenditure. So if we look at how we measure the different components of energy expenditure, we can assess energy expenditure as a whole. So we can quantify total energy expenditure, but we can actually individually quantify each of these components. So I guess what this study really looked at was to determine and quantify resting metabolic rate across the academy age range. Now, if we want to assess resting metabolic rate, the most common way within research is probably through indirect calorimetry. And what indirect calorimetry is it assesses oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production, so in a rested state. But again, this requires standardization of the individual So an overnight fast, lack of training in the hours prior to. So measures really have to be done in the morning. It requires individuals who know how to use the equipment, and it obviously requires specialist equipment. So within the bike practice, it's not commonplace to measure resting metabolic rate by indirect calorimetry. And for that reason, there's been a number of different prediction equations developed over the last few years. And the first ever prediction equation for resting metabolic rate was actually developed in 1918 by Harris and Benedict, sorry. So this field of study has been going on for over 100 years. So I guess the aim of this specific study was threefold. First of all, we wanted to assess and quantify the differences in body composition and resting metabolic rate across the academy age range. We wanted to compare measured resting metabolic rate values with estimated resting metabolic rate values, and again compared to some of the different prediction equations that were previously published. And finally, we wanted to develop a novel prediction equation that was specific for this population. So this was a cross-sectional in design, this study, and I should say this was part of a longitudinal study. So this was actually the third time point. So we had 2 familiarization time points prior to this study, this time point. So again, all individuals were familiarized with both the DEXA and the resting metabolic rate assessment. So we took 99 players from the under 12s age group up towards the under 23s age group, all males, and they come in under standardized conditions. So we took stature, body mass, and sitting height. We then put them on the DEXA scan, and they had a whole body DEXA scan, followed by a resting metabolic rate assessment. And we followed the protocol outlined by Bone and Burke back in 2018. And, yeah. The resting metabolic values were then compared against different predicted values from these 5 different equations. So we can see the 5 different equations here. And these equations were selected because they fitted one of our 2 predetermined criteria. So they fitted either the age range of our population, which was chronological ages of 11 to 23, or they were developed in at least a healthy and active population. Now we can see here that there was actually only two of the prediction equations that fitted both criteria, the Kim and the Wong. And the Kim was actually developed in 16-year-old recreational soccer players in Asia. So the Kim population was probably the most similar to our population. What we can see here is each of the different equations and each of their predictor variables highlighted in blue there. Now we can see here that each equation has different variables within the equation, some using simple measures such as stature and body mass, and some using others such as fat-free mass. And I should say as well here that fat-free mass in some of the different equations was not actually directly assessed. It was estimated using a number of different methods. So what we can see here is the number of individuals within each age group. So it's no surprise as they get older, they obviously get more mature. And we can see here that most individuals come through peak height velocity around under 13, under 14 age group, which is pretty common compared to other academy players throughout the Premier League. Again, no real surprise that as they get older and more mature, they obviously increase in both stature and body mass. What this graph here shows is the percentage of predicted adult stature. And in this study, we used the Shearer equation. Now, we used the Shearer equation over the Kazmich-Roche for a number of different reasons, which I can go into later, but that was the equation that we used. And we can see here at under 12s, they're in and around 85, 86% of predicted adult stature. And then they have most of them have reached adult stature by around under 16, under 18. And again, I think from nutrition practice, I think that has implications, certainly for manipulation of energy and body composition, which we can discuss later. So this graph shows nicely that most of the increases in body mass come from increases in fat-free mass. So we can see here that the under 12s age group, about 30 kilograms of fat-free mass, increasing to around 55, 60 within the older age groups. And this data continues on nicely from some work that Jordan Milston did a few years ago when he was at Liverpool Football Club. If we then look at absolute fat mass, so that's kilograms of fat on the body, we can see that there's no real differences between age groups, which is interesting. So sitting in and around 10 kilograms of fat mass within the body. Now, if we then look at that in relative terms, so percent body fat, so because there was an increase in fat-free mass, no change in absolute fat mass, there was then a decrease in relative body fat percentage from 12 to 14, after which there was a plateau. And again, this has implications for practice, particularly around body composition monitoring within the younger age groups. So if we then go on and look at the resting metabolic rate data, we can see here in the under 12s age group, they're in around 1700 kilocalories per day, increasing and then plateauing within the older age groups. And again, this data probably follows a similar trend to the increase in fat-free mass. Now, what we did was we then carried out some allometric scaling analysis on the resting metabolic rate data. And the reason we did this is because there wasn't a linear and proportional relationship between fat-free mass and resting metabolic rate. Now, what I mean by this is you can see that on the blue line there that it doesn't follow that white dashed line. So it's not linear and proportional. So per kilogram increase of fat-free mass did not equate to proportional increase in resting metabolic rate. And that's to do with fat-free mass containing different tissues. So fat-free mass is comprised of muscle and organs, and all of the different organs have different metabolic rates. So something like the brain, heart is quite metabolically active, whereas certain other organs are not as metabolically active. So as an individual grows, so progresses from say under 12 up to 23, the proportion of these tissues within fat-free mass change. So what allometric scaling does is produces a size-independent RMR variable. Now, once this data went through the scaling process, the appropriate scaling process, what we can see here is that relative RMR actually does not change between age groups. So it's similar between all players. Now that's quite a complex process to try to describe. So I'm happy to discuss that in detail with anyone after. Now, what this graph then shows is the difference in our measured resting metabolic rate values compared to our predicted values for each different equation. So we can see each of the different equations along the bottom x-axis. And what the numbers on the y-axis represents is the difference between the two values. So we can see here that as a main value, all equations underestimated resting metabolic rate. Now, if we take a certain individual here, so if we look at the yellow dots representing the Cunningham equation, and if we look right down the bottom of that there, we can see that in this certain individual, the Cunningham equation underestimated resting metabolic rate by nearly 900 kilocalories per day. And again, that can have significant implications that I'll discuss in a moment. So we then did some least squares regression analysis to compare each measured resting metabolic rate value compared to each of the different equations. Now, what least squares regression does is identifies both fixed and proportional bias. So if the intercept of the bit of the middle blue line in each equation, so if you carry that middle blue line onto the left-hand side, that'll give you an intercept value. Now, if that intercept value differs from 0, which they all did because they don't sit along that dashed line, there was fixed bias present. So there's actually fixed bias present in every equation. And then the slope of the line, so the angle of the blue line for each equation did not, as you can see there, did not fit along that dashed line. So again, the slope was different to 1. So there was also proportional bias present. So what this really shows is that each of the equations that we assessed were pretty poor at estimating resting metabolic rate, at least in this population. So what does that actually mean? Well, I guess from a practitioner point of view, if you were doing some sort of energy prescription using these equations, you could potentially underestimate resting metabolic rate and therefore total energy expenditure also. So the energy requirements would lead you to prescribing low energy availability. Okay, so if low energy availability occurs days on days and weeks on weeks, that can lead and develop into relative energy deficiency in sport, or also known as REDS. And what we know about REDS is that it is a number of different health and also performance implications. So if we first of all look at the health implications of REDS, there's a couple that are particularly pertinent to the growing and developing athlete. So first of all, if we look at growth and maturation, growth can actually be stunted and maturation can be delayed. And then if we look at bone health, particularly bone mineral density, can be reduced. Now that can have implications for fracture risk now, so increased risk of fracture, but it can also have health implications for something like osteoporosis in 30, 40, 50 years down the line. If we then look at the performance implications, there's a whole host of different physiological and also psychological performance implications. So this chronic low energy availability can significantly impair the performance of a youth academy player. So what we did was then, using multiple stepwise regression, we developed our own prediction equation. And in the analysis, we put in a number of different predictor variables. So we entered stature, body mass, percentage of predicted adult stature, and also fat-free mass. Now, what that analysis did was determine that fat-free mass was actually the strongest variable, and it was the only variable that it actually included within the initial equation. Now, after some discussion with some of my other co-authors, it was actually decided that, we assessed fat-free mass using DEXA, but again, a lot of clubs and a lot of academies don't have access to this kind of equipment. So we wanted to develop an equation that could be easily used within all academies. So we then reran the regression analysis, stepwise multiple regression with both stature and body mass. And again, this was the second equation that I come up with. So again, just using a simple body mass as a predictor variable. So I guess this data highlights that, during the academy pathway, particularly between the ages of chronological ages of 12 and 16, is a key period for growth, maturation, and physical development, during which energy requirements are increased. Current resting metabolic rate prediction equations may significantly underestimate energy requirements, and in our opinion, we did not deem them suitable for use within this population. And again, our novel prediction equations may be used to provide an estimate of resting metabolic rate in academy footballers. But what I would say to that is, if you can measure, do measure. And finally, I'd just like to thank my other co-authors. This was very much a team effort. So yeah, thanks very much. And thank you all for listening.
Thanks very much, Marcus. That was brilliant, mate. Really interesting. First of all, did you standardised the RMR when it was in relation to match day, and what are your thoughts and variation of RMR across days, mate?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. Now, what we did, Liam, was we collected this data over a period of about 4 weeks. And obviously you've got a certain window within each morning to do them, because the individual who's getting assessed has to be fasted and whatnot. You can only really do it from probably 7 o'clock in the morning to about 11 o'clock, or that was the time frame from at least which we did it in. Now, we didn't standardize the day before, so it wasn't necessarily a training day, rest day, match day. But one thing that Julia Bone showed in some of her work was that, actually if 12 hours after exercise was probably enough. Now, I know there's been some good work in rugby done that showing resting metabolic rate actually is increased for a day or two after match play, but I think that's probably owing to the large amounts of muscle damage done, within collisions in rugby. So I think in an ideal world we would have done that, but given the applied nature of trying to get 100 people through the door over a 4-week period, we were probably time pushed.
Yeah, definitely. How much difference would you say there's much difference in RMR? And it's probably more of an opinion, mate, with such especially over congested fixture periods in teams such as under 18s and under 23s.
Yeah, I think that would probably be more evident the higher level you got. Obviously, the more powerful and the more muscle damage, let's just say, within the higher age groups. I'd say RMR would, I wouldn't say to the same extent as some of the rugby lads, but I would say there's a slight element owing to the muscle repair that would need to occur in the days after.
Yeah. Okay. Does anyone else from the panel have a question?
Yeah, I've got a question. Two in fact. So
yeah, that's a crack on, mate. The more discussion, better.
The first one was, so you've mentioned about growth maturation and the changes in RMR during that period, and then also the changes in fat-free mass. Do you think that those two changes would be more related to peak height velocity or peak weight velocity?
Yeah, well, I mean, we obviously know that the peak weight velocity, as I showed David, most of the increase in body mass were actually from fat-free mass, because there's no real changes in absolute mass. So it is, of course, peak weight velocity. But again, I think it's it's a good question, and I think there's certainly more work to be done in this area. I think this is a cross-sectional in design. One thing that I would really like to look at is maybe, if you could monitor this, every month as an individual is actually going through peak height velocity or through peak weight velocity, what influence does that have on RMR changes? But that would obviously be a very difficult study to look at, just given the nature of trying to get these individuals into the building to do this.
Yeah. Do we have any of that sort of information in normal population kids?
Not that I've seen, no.
Okay, cool. And then sort of my second question, which leads a bit on from the first presentation and also something that I'd spoken about within my own PhD. So you've mentioned that we're not really meeting the energy requirements during peak height velocity. Do you think that has any sort of link or implications with regards to injury during that period as well?
100%, yeah. So I mean, so meeting energy requirements, we know that your energy requirements are dictated by your total energy expenditure. So this was actually just looking at one component of total energy expenditure. But what we've one of the follow-up studies we did was looking at actually total energy expenditure, and we assessed that over a 2-week period using doubly labeled water. And what we actually saw that is, on the whole, players are meeting, at least in the population we looked at, they are meeting their energy requirements. Now, one thing we do know, and if you can flick your mind back to the slide I showed with the little circles, the reds, the implications of reds, So what that is if you're chronically under consuming energy over a period of time, that is all the implications that can happen to an individual. So again, it can cause a stunting of growth, a failure to actually achieve what you genetically probably could have, and it also will delay maturation as well.
Yeah, brilliant.
And I would say that, in the population we looked at, it didn't seem to be an issue, but having spoken to Liam, for example, we were very lucky in the club that at Everton there was a lot of nutrition education. There was also a lot of nutrition provision. I know Liam at Crewe doesn't have any nutrition provision to his lads. So again, it's probably more prevalent, let's just say the lower down the leagues you go.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's probably also quite a big case-by-case basis of what kids get provided, good food and good lunches at home and that sort of thing as well.
100%, yeah.
And can I just jump in with a tiny third little one?
Go for it, David.
Sorry. So you've spoken there about the energy sort of side. Is there any other really quick recommendations you could give about other nutritional recommendations through that period?
I think probably you look at energy first, and then obviously, from a fat-free mass point of view, protein is going to be important in terms of total amount, but also timing of protein and type as well. But I would say, the first thing we need to look at in this population is energy. Just, are they consuming enough? And I think by a product, if they are eating enough, they probably are hitting most of their macronutrient recommendations just because of the sheer quantity.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much for those answers.
Just on that little bit, Marcus, there, I remember having a conversation, I think it was with you and Graham, and I can't remember what age group, I think it was the under 15 now, and it's in your next study, your follow-on study, and they were expending almost 5,000 calories a day. And yeah, and it was like, and Graham actually came out and said, like, how is he meant to get all that energy into that player cleanly?
Yeah.
So it was like, and you've told me some of the things which you sort of introduced at Everton, which are brilliant and obviously really practical ideas for them players. So it just goes to show like that's a simple translational sort of potential for that study. And I think I asked you this question a few weeks ago: is where would you put it on the paper to podium?
Yeah, it's something I actually did, Liam, after we discussed it. So I would rank this. Well, this specific study is a 7. So on the positive side.
Yeah. I thought it'd be around about then. It's 18 to 18, isn't it?
Minus 18
plus 18. Yeah.
I thought it was a 7, but yeah, I mean, there's given the nature of the population and what we did, there's definite translational potential for this research.
Good. Any more questions from the panel?
Yeah, go on. I've got a couple of questions. Really nice study. It's not really my area, so you'll have to excuse if they're dumb questions. But I just wondered how accurately your prediction equation kind of matched your data.
So the two ones that we developed? Yeah,
the novel ones.
Yeah, so the standard error they estimate was about 163 calories. But again, there was no sort of, there was no fixed or proportional bias, so there's no systematic over or underestimating of it. Yeah. Now, one thing we did try to highlight in the paper was, with any prediction equation, not just a prediction equation for rest and metabolic rate, the Murrowald equation or, any prediction equation, there's going to be error. So one thing we did try to highlight was, if you can directly assess rest and metabolic rate, via indirect calorimetry, you definitely should do that.
Brilliant.
If possible.
Excellent. And my only other question really was, has anyone considered doing this in female players?
Great question. And I haven't seen any work in female soccer players, but again, it's definitely something, as with a lot of other studies, we definitely should. I think probably, the reason we did this was I was embedded within and working with that population, so they were easily accessible, let's just say. I know a lot of the female academies, unfortunately, aren't as set up, down to under 12 at a sort of full-time basis yet, anyway.
Yeah, definitely. And I suspect you'll see some very, very different results in females, given the different kind of sort of responses post maturation.
Yeah, and body composition as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Excellent.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Mark.
Jump quickly on one as well.
Go on, yeah. Go, Tom.
Marcus, you mentioned quite near the start just the use of the shearer method as opposed to Carmus ropes with the peak adult stature.
Yeah.
I think I probably already know, but why did you go for that option?
No, I was expecting this question. As we're aware, there's a number of different methods available, and we did use Cosmos ropes. Now the problem with the Cosmos ropes is you actually need parental mid-height. Now in quite a few of our players, we couldn't get parental mid-height for a number of different reasons. Single parent families, or not knowing who mum and dad were. So there was quite a few cases of that. So the shearer equation doesn't require parental mid-height, and that's the reason for us using that. That was the reason for us using that over the Cosmos Rush.
Thank you.
Good. I've just got a few more from the Q&A on here, Marcus, mate. So did you, and I know you didn't necessarily look at this in the study, but you might have looked at it after it for the actual club. Did you notice any positional differences or any trends in the body composition and the RMR across age groups?
Yeah, no, interesting, mate. It's not actually something we looked at. At Everton Academy, they didn't really box them into positions until probably under 15s, 16s. So particularly in the younger age groups, they generally played, everywhere. They would, depending on what time of the year, they did lots of different stuff to mix it up. So it's perhaps something we could have done in the older age groups, but it's not something I've done.
Yeah, because I don't know, did Jordan Milson do any work in his 18s to first team study in that body composition one, or did he just keep it simple?
I can't quite remember. I mean, the obvious differences, will probably be your likes of your centre halves and your goalkeepers, just bigger and taller and generally heavier.
Yeah, there's the obvious one with the lean body mass of the player I think it's the under 18s compared to, I think there must be about 3 or 4 kilos difference of lean body mass from the top under 12 to the lowest under 18, which when you think about the actual size and stature of those individuals, it's actually quite astonishing, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and particularly in the fat-free mass data, there was quite large differences even within a single age group. And again, that'll become more prominent probably at the older age groups, and owing to the different positional demands and whatnot.
Yeah. I've got another question from an anonymous attendee. Do you think that the equations which you created, do you think they can be used in different populations apart from footballers?
Look, at the minute, I'd say probably not. I mean, one thing this study highlighted was that the equations that you use are very population specific. So I think if they were to be used in other equations, I think there would definitely have to be some sort of validation work, within other athletes of different sports, because they will have probably different body compositions and amongst other factors. Yeah. They may or may not be as highly trained as some of these guys. And I think another thing to point out as well, Liam, is the ethnicity difference. Ethnicity has quite a large influence on rest and metabolic rates. So again, the population, there's a number of factors that you'd have to look into. So I'd say at the minute, no.
Yeah. Okay, good. And then, if no one else has got any, probably the last one from me, but has anyone else got any questions?
Not necessarily a question, Marcus, but thanks very much for your presentation. I think your paper's excellent, mate. I'm looking forward to your energy expenditure one coming up next. I think there's just lots of really good bits of info on this. I know fat-free mass isn't really directly muscle mass, but there's going to be a vast majority of that will be muscle mass. And it's just looking at, I know it's cross-sectional, but looking at the increments from 13s to 14s, 14s to 15s, and 15s to 16s, there's some really big increments of kilograms of fat-free mass, aren't there? Up to almost 8.5, 9 kilos. So I guess there's not a specific question potentially, but it kind of warrants that what is the importance? We all measure fat mass very, very regularly all the time through skin folds, and yet realistically that doesn't really change that much from under 13s to under 23s. It's always going to be in and around sort of 9 to 10 kilos. So I guess it just warrants more attention to the long-term athlete development model on putting a bit more muscle mass on, concentrating on strength, looking at the long game, not being overly concerned about month to month or even season to season fluctuations, because realistically that will probably sort itself out. And it's probably more important in terms of the talent development pathway to maybe concentrate on other areas. I don't know if that's anything that you discussed with the coaches at Everton or anything you've taken to Villa.
Yeah, look, Ollie, it's a great point. The largest increases coincided, with peak height velocity, peak weight velocity, which you'd expect. Now, this was although this was cross-sectional, this is actually part of a longitudinal study where we carried out a longitudinal study, sort of, which this was part of. So we assessed, we did this study every three or 4 months. So 3 times a season, start, middle, end of season. So we've got 2 years worth of data on that, which we'll get to publishing further down the line. And that will really highlight individual differences in or increases in fat-free mass. But you're completely right in terms of, we definitely shouldn't be, particularly, and one of the reasons I showed the percentage of predicted adult stature. We know that at least in this population, and I'd say in most Premier League academies, they probably reached adult stature by around 16, 17, 18 years of age. Now, until that point, I don't think there should be any emphasis on body fat, let's just say. I think the emphasis should really be on maximizing fat-free mass development. And we may or may not, we probably shouldn't be, but definitely in the younger age groups, be focusing on body composition, body fat assessments.
And I think it's really interesting as well that you've mentioned that if some youth players might need 5,000 calories a day, or that they could be burning that many, so their sort of calorie intake is going to be a lot higher. And like Liam said, your ability to take that in inverted commas in a clean way or a healthy way is going to be really, really tough. Plus they're kids, so it's going to be, so it is, I couldn't agree more that, and also the time, if it takes 5, 7, maybe 8 minutes to do a sum of 7, sum of 8, and if you were doing that, especially with some of the older players, even once a month, or maybe even, as you said, 3 or 4 times a year, the amount of time that you're going to go through just collecting data, processing data, feeding it back, surely there's an efficiency issue here that you can spend your sort of time elsewhere, potentially, of making your processes better. I guess there is a link to maybe the psychological side or the mentality side of eating well, potentially. I think you could argue that one, but no, I think it's some really interesting stuff. So thanks very much. Looking forward. When's your next one? Is that been accepted yet, or is that kind of in the pipelines? Or
revisions have just gone into back into review there, literally the other day. So fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, mate. Top man. Cheers, Marcus.
Cheers, Ollie.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, everyone, for that discussion. That was brilliant. And well done to Marcus as well on this. I think this is one of the clear examples where you quite easily, you read a paper and you underestimate actually how much work has gone into it. Marcus has, and he'll tell you himself, and I seen him around the university as he was doing it, and he was getting the kids into the John Moores. So how many miles? About 20 miles away, something from Finch Farm, Marcus?
Yeah, it was about a half-hour drive. Yeah, so I mean, one thing I had to do was liaise with every parent guardian and get them there. Unfortunately, the club couldn't bring them in because because they had to come from home and it had to be first thing in the morning, and the club didn't bring them in, so parents and guardians. So there was a massive logistical challenge, but yeah, we got there in the end.
Yeah, I think even again, around things like ethical approval and stuff like that. I know you had a very interesting one for this one, but again, I think that's something to go into in a later date, and we'll sort of move on, mate. But thank you, very well done. I think it's a brilliant study, and I hope, really, like Ollie said, I'm looking forward to seeing the rest of your PhD come out, mate.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on again. Cheers.
No worries, mate. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Liam.
Thank you.
So, yeah, as Liam said, this sort of study looks at seasonal changes in physical performance of elite youth female football. So just for probably a little bit of context for those not familiar sort of with the girls' pathway, this work's kind of focused on what's called the regional talent clubs, which basically follows a similar format to the Triple P, in that rather than obviously necessarily just directly being called academies, they fall into being a regional talent centre. So they could be a tier 1 or tier 2, tier 3, again following sort of that similar structure in terms of requirements for EPPP, but just slightly scaled down based on resources in the girls' academy structure. But they still are generally linked to clubs. So, for example, Leeds United, the context I'm working in, obviously has a girls' academy, and the majority of clubs across the country have an associated girls' academy, but there is other ones that sit outside of that. So, for example, Matthrew Wright, who's obviously on the panel as well today, is with Teeside, so they're not directly associated to a boys' club or academy, but is one of the sort of leading clubs in the country. So there is a little bit of differentiation there, but it's generally the girls' club structure, falling from under 10s to under 16s. So under 10s and 12s will train 2 nights a week and play on a weekend, and then the 14s and 16s will have have 3 training sessions a week, and again play on a weekend as well. Let me move on.
Is that all right, or?
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
So yeah, just a bit of context, I guess, to where the research came from. So this study the data was collected across the 2016-2017 season, and probably at that time there's an acknowledgement sort of within the girls' game and the women's game generally in this country that there was still a need to really focus on increasing athleticism of our female players. And an acknowledgement really that needed to start at a younger age, which aligned to the restructure of these regional talent centres. So the structure had been slightly different before that, and not quite as much provision from a physical performance, nutrition, psychology, etc. So this restructuring of the regional talent centres was designed to align with this goal of trying to develop athleticism in our female players, and the acknowledgement that to really maximise that long term, we also needed to start focusing with our young players and couldn't just invest everything at the senior level. So some of the kind of questions that were coming from the coaches, which kind of really drove the direction of this research. So I spoke to a number of technical directors when they were sort of submitting for this restructure, because as part of it, they had to evidence the physical profiling they were doing, how they were tracking players, how they were monitoring, and how they were applying sort of long-term athletic development structures within their academies. And what kind of key questions that came out from coaches, and what became apparent, was that there was quite a lot of variability between girls' academies in terms of what they were doing. Some of that was restrictions based on resources that they had, either where they were based or equipment they had access to. They didn't really know, a lot of the clubs, around what their data meant beyond the players that they were working with. So they only had comparisons to their own data. No acknowledgement really of how that compared to more elite standards, and acknowledgement from the growing research in the boys' game that growth and maturation was likely impacting upon the physical development of their players, but not really sure how to consider that in terms of one, reviewing physical performance, but then in terms of were those findings transferable to the girls' context, and then obviously building upon that, sort of what were the best strategies to develop athleticism. And that kind of led to kind of a body of initial work, which built on some work that Matt had done initially in the previous structure of 13s to 15s, and then led to probably the study that I'm going to focus on today was almost the final one of that initial part of the work. So we first started just looking at exploring athletic development from a cross-sectional perspective by age and maturity status, and managed to work with a cohort of 3 Tier 1 academies. So I was leading this on my own at the time, and I just started a role as a senior lecturer as well. So it was quite a juggle to try and be directly working with 3 different clubs, collecting data and doing the research at the same time. So the sample size wasn't huge, but 3 clubs allowed us to generalise the findings a little bit more than off 1 club. And some just key findings that we came out of these initial studies. One was around strength. So I think what was quite novel in our testing battery was that we had a measurement of strength, acknowledging the importance of that in both male and female players, from obviously an injury prevention perspective, but as an underlying prerequisite for things such as speed, change of direction, etc., which are obviously important characteristics within match play. But the differences we observed in the female players to what we'd seen in the boys' data, particularly around that period of maturation. So it's obviously widely acknowledged that we get that adolescent awkward period that we've seen in the male data as well. But then generally, as boys hit post-peak height velocity, increase in the mass, increase in strength, and improvements in relative strength. However, in the girls, we were actually seeing that relative strength actually plateaued or decreased in the data, and the potential implications of that from an injury perspective, obviously acknowledging the increased number of prevalence, particularly around ACL and ankle injuries in female players. And then again, thinking around developing athleticism, that strength may be a limiting factor of some of those other qualities that we were seeing as well. And then in the final part of that study, seeing associations between relative strength and a likely difference in 10-metre sprint time, and then unclear changes with counter movement jump and change of direction time around that period of maturation and post. So probably the first indication of seeing some differences in the data between the boys and girls, and potential implications that had for training practices, particularly in that around that circa and post-peak height velocity group in the girls, and that aligned to some of the findings that Matt Wright as well had also found in some of his previous work in this area. So the study that we then went on to do was then to look at that across a season. It wasn't possible to continue this from one season to the next for a number of reasons, and I'll allude to that further on. But we decided that we'd look at these physical qualities across 3 time points. So we had start of the season, mid-season and end of season across 3 of the clubs, standardised testing battery with that as well, and then a pretty much standard protocol in terms of testing battery that's consistent within the literature, but with that added measure of the isometric mid-thigh pull, which at the time, as I said, this data was 2016-17, it was collected, was quite a novel test that was added within there as well. So some of the key findings that we saw, so just breaking it down per age group really. So this was the under 10 data, and what we actually saw was when we looked at speed, that they actually progressively got slower across the season, as they did in terms of their change of direction scores, and that was actually despite an increase in relative strength. But as expected within that age group, we saw big increases in height and body mass with that as well. So while potentially relative strength was going up, implications around coordination and fundamental movement skills, potential for training application around that in terms of movement quality as well, and what the focus should be within training. Similar with the under 12s, in terms of their data, we saw that 10 metre speed, again, they got slower across the season, and that we actually saw either no change or trivial changes in some of the other kind of speed, change of direction, and counter movement performance. Again, potential implications, obviously girls hitting peak height velocity at a younger age than the boys, and that again was despite seeing across the season, pre to post, an increase in relative strength. So relative strength was going up, but there was either decrease in performance in terms of speed, change of direction, or there was no significant change in performance. Again, suggesting potentially around that 10 to 12 age group. Implications of large changes in particularly probably height with that, leg length, and body mass, and implications that may have in terms of focuses within training. When we looked at the under 14s with their data, we did see that there was a trend in the changes. So we did see that yo-yoing performance. We got a significant increase in yo-yo performance, change of direction performance, which did increase across the season. But we did have these initial time points of the speed again, where we didn't see those significant changes occurring. And then lastly, with the under 16 data, actually almost seeing improvements in performance across those key performance indicators that we were looking at in terms of relative strength, change of direction, counter movement, jump, and aerobic performance. Almost potentially, as you would expect, seeing that shift from what you see in the boys in terms of the age groups that we're seeing those changes occurring, but linking that back to the data that we'd collected in the previous studies, those potential implications around strength development versus a focus on more movement pattern and motor control at the different age groups. So the key findings we took away from the studies was that under 10s and under 12 players experienced decreases in performance in terms of change of direction, speed, and counter movement jump performance, despite an increase in relative strength across the season. And as I said, those findings were consistent with some of the work Matt had done with some other colleagues previously when the age groups were under 13 and under 15, and the potential implications of growth and maturation on that data. So generally a focus upon fundamental movement skills, running mechanics, and neuromuscular control may be appropriate for those age groups, and an awareness of the large individual variability within the data of those age groups. One thing within the girls' academy structure is that it's banded in those 2-year groups, so it's under 10s, 12s, 14s, 16s, and the quite large variability within participants we were seeing within particularly that under 12 age group. So again, highlighting the importance of really tracking that individual through that period. And then from the 14s and 16s, actually almost seeing then starting to get improvements in speed, counter movement, jump, relative strength, and change of direction ability from pre to post season. But acknowledging that we actually saw most of those changes in the first part of the season, and actually we're seeing either no changes in the second half of the season, or actual decreases in performance, but still an overall change across the season. From a training perspective, the implications for that around the development of relative strength, focus on neuromuscular control, and also metabolic conditioning. So from some of the other data in the female game, we see similar to the boys game in terms of the importance of high-speed running ability to differentiate between standards of competition. And actually at this 14 to 16 age group, we see a plateau in that development. So the potential implications for training around those age groups. And again, Matt's done some work on that, highlighting the application of some repeated high intensity effort training alongside the standard training practices that are occurring within the academy can allow metabolic performance to continue to develop as well. But the natural development of metabolic systems generally plateaus in girls around that age, potentially aligning with some of those different hormonal changes we see. So the increase in female specific hormones such as estrogen and the link with increased fat mass and the implications that has on potentially relative strength and also metabolic conditioning. Probably just acknowledging sort of limitations within this study in terms of that one, we didn't have a control group in terms of an age matched sort of school cohort, for example. So it wasn't really possible to determine how those seasonal changes compared to an age matched group who weren't undertaking academy training to really evaluate the success of that, and that we weren't able to get training exposure in terms of monitoring actual loading. So unlike the boys' academies, there's quite limited resources within the girls' structure to be able to do that. So unfortunately, those were kind of two key limitations within the study. So really where that work started is where we're at now. So as I said, we published that paper in 2018 and was actually collected across the 2016-17 data, but it probably raised a lot more questions than it did answers in terms of what we need to be looking at and the need for further work in this area. So where we're at now is we're working with the FA. So we actually have 3 PhD students working across the women's game now. 2 of those match funded between the FA and Leeds Beckett, and 1 directly funded by Leeds Beckett. I'm just going to briefly touch on the work that Jake Beach is doing because his directly aligns to this, and the purpose of it was to further grow this work and expand it beyond this initial 1 season, and to also kind of expand that across a number of clubs. So where we've tried to go about it in terms of recruiting clubs is to try and offer them something back. As we said, in terms of the boys structure, there's quite a lot of limited support for the girls outside of the direct contact time in terms of things like they don't have PMA or other resources such as that. So Jake's basically looking at physical profiling and injury profiling across the girls' talent pathway, so 10s to 16s across as many clubs we can get on board at a tier 1 level. So he's currently got 12 clubs signed up for next season, and we've done some pilot data this year. So what Jake's developed with that as part of his PhD, using Data Studio as an online platform, is that we can support clubs by giving clubs their data back straight after. They can look at that by different time points, but trying to align to some of the questions the coaches have. It has additional sheets built into the Data Studio that allows them then to profile their players against all of the players across the country that have been tested. So similar to kind of resources that are embedded within the boys' academy, but we've had to almost be a bit more creative with how we develop those in the girls' game. So allows them to compare them to the trend line across age groups and the option by maturity status, and to compare their player against all of the players at that stage. And then we've trialled this with 6 clubs this season. So we've actually in the process of just writing this up for a paper, but we've got injury data and exposure data for 6 tier 1 academies this season. But with that, we've developed this live platform for clubs to use. So a club practitioner can go on at any time and look at their injury rates, how that compares against the other clubs that are part of the project across the country as well. And they can do that also by breakdown of injury type as well. So I think the way we've kind of managed to get buy-in from the research side is to try and give back to the club something that they can use directly, and they see the benefit and translation of what we're trying to do into their practice. And then just lastly, just thanking, as the others did, just the other guys involved in this project who supported this study and beyond that, in terms of Kev, Sean, Tom and Ben as well. So, thanks.
Thank you very much, Stacey. I thought that was brilliant. Yeah, and it's good to see the sort of the progression that the women's game is showing now, and it's sort of moving on. And you can see that with the PhDs that are embedded into the likes of the FA and the women's game, it really is going to probably push on that research just a lot more. Like you said then at the end, with regards to just showing the coaches what it can provide them with and giving them something back.
Yeah, I think we had, as I said, we had 6 clubs this year, and that took quite a lot of work to get to that point, and a lot of follow-up with them throughout that. We then, I guess a fortunate aspect of the current circumstances was we were able to set up a webinar, and Jake led on that we set up with all clubs in the country, and because of the current climate, we were able to get pretty much representation from every club at Tier 1 on that call. And once clubs could kind of see the feedback they could get from engaging in this work and the resources that we were trying to develop, and we asked them what they would like within those reports, it's hugely increased buy-in. So I think the more we can, directly show the clubs and the club staff how this influences their practice, and the whole premise behind it is to support what they're doing in practice, it just helps increase that buy-in.
Definitely. Does anyone from the panel have any questions? Matt, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I've got a couple. How are you doing, Stacey? All right?
Good, thanks, Matt. How are you?
Yeah, not bad. Just I suppose one question. It's more around how we use the data. But do you see these an issue in terms of trying to create some kind of progressive overload, particularly with the older girls, when you're sort of juggling, trying to get that neuromuscular control that's important, also developing things like aerobic fitness within an RTC environment? And might that explain why the changes you got were in the first part of the season and didn't continue throughout?
Yeah, I think there has been some similar trends seen in some of the boys' data as well, and I think it potentially also aligns to that period of obviously pre-season. There is quite a big focus on developing fitness, developing physical qualities, and then as they get into season, and it's probably no different in the boys and girls game, in that there's still that focus on the game at the weekend, even at the youth level, despite everyone saying it's about the long-term development of the player. I think also, as you said, there is some constraints in terms of that strength overload from multiple factors. I think one, the time that generally needs to be dedicated in terms of developing motor control, neuromuscular control, and movement quality with the girls, but equally as well, some challenges just around the context and resources. So some clubs are fortunate that they're aligned to the boys' academy quite well, and they have access to gym facilities, etc. But others don't. So, for example, at Leeds, the girls' academy is actually based out of a school environment and doesn't have access to gym space. So everything has to be pitch-based, and that obviously constrains some of the things that you can do and you've got to kind of, I guess, explore other ways of trying to get some overload into those players.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. I suppose my other question that I had was more, not on the research itself, but I just wondered if you had any reflections on actually testing those, particularly the amount of testing you had to do within 3 different RTCs and going into an RTC environment and trying to do that kind of testing. Whether you had any reflections on that that'd be quite useful to share.
Yeah, it was quite comprehensive, but I think it aligned to what the clubs were doing. So we were actually quite conscious of obviously not wanting to go in and change everything completely as to what they were doing. But equally, I think it was quite efficient how we did it in terms of working with the club staff and other practitioners in the club to kind of make that flow really and have a carousel of stations. So it was only really took 1 training session for each time point. Obviously, the more, I guess, we could look at relationships between different tests, and from a data perspective, if there's collinearity in terms of what those variables are telling us, then we can try and reduce that. So that's something that we are kind of discussing with the FA at the moment, because I think what's key as well, what we're trying to do at the moment is trying to standardise a testing battery that aligns as well with what the international setup are doing as much as possible, so that we can actually track these players long term, because I think that's what's missing as well, generally across the data as well within the boys game, is that ability to track players over 5, 6, 7 years, starting pre-peak height velocity all the way through.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's obviously a challenge in lots of research, isn't it? How you can continue it on. Excellent. Did I have another question? The only other question really that I've got, and it's similar to some data we found, how you saw these decrements in speed in the under 10s and the under 12s, but I suppose particularly in that youngest age group in terms of speed and change of directional ability. I just wondered if you had any more thoughts on that, and how you might, any advice to practitioners, I suppose, working within RTCs or working with that age group, what things they can develop and practical tips.
Yeah, I think what we did see still within that data at the under 10 level was actually big increases in height during that period as well. And I think just kind of key is just to really focus on the fundamental movement skills with those players and the basics really, including obviously running mechanics, etc. And then I guess from a practical perspective, it's just keeping that fun and engaging as well. Generally with the girls, I think it's getting better as education in the young players is developing, and the awareness of older senior players doing gym-based work and other S&C based work. But I think probably at the time of this date as well, there was a little bit resistance around, or taboo still around S&C with the young girls, and probably the added challenge I think with female players versus boys around that peak height velocity period is also the psychosocial aspect as well, and some girls not necessarily wanting to engage in what they perceive to be strength work, or hesitations around pushing themselves and overloading in that aspect, more from an aesthetics perspective. So using language such as not wanting to look bulky and things like that. So I think there's an education process that it's important that continues in the girls' game as well, and the importance of doing strength-based work from both an injury and a performance perspective.
Yeah. And have you seen improvement in that, in terms of the way that girls kind of are more keen on doing strength training now? Have you seen that change since this study?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that generally aligns to what the greater media profile as well as of the senior game. So I think the more now that girls can see role models in the senior game, and they see whether it's actually in their own club environment, they get to see older players in the gym or doing strength-based work in other environments, or whether it's in England generally now put out a lot of video resources and other things like that. So that's one thing that we try and do at Leeds with some of the education, is actually use images or videos of players that they aspire to be like doing these types of training.
Yeah, excellent, brilliant. That's all from me. The great study, certainly one that I go back to quite a lot. So yeah, excellent.
Thanks for the questions, Matt. And Stacey, I just got a question from Andy Jenkinson, and it's probably a little bit more for the older girls in the study, but could there have been any effects on the menstrual cycle on the physical performance across the season?
Yeah, I think at the moment, menstrual cycle is a really topical area at the moment, from a research perspective and in the media. I think the short answer, yes, there potentially could be, in terms of there is some research that suggests that the different stages of the menstrual cycle, one may impact physical performance and may impact other areas in terms of psychological demands, nutritional demands, etc. However, the literature is not strong enough yet for us to really make strong conclusions about that. There's a lot of limitations in terms of how phase of menstrual cycle is established, which therefore kind of has implications for the limitations of the data. So I think where we're at in terms of working with a female athlete at the moment, whether it's in football or in any other female sport really, is starting to educate females around the menstrual cycle and in terms of tracking it and monitoring it. And once we do that and can look at the symptoms, then we can progress on to the next phase. But a challenge of it's quite costly to really track the menstrual cycle properly with the phase, and it's quite invasive. And we know because of such individual variability that actually just using recall and diaries is going to be not accurate enough to really establish where we get those hormonal fluctuations that may impact performance. So the short answer, yes, potentially, but we can't really answer that at the moment.
I suppose that just throws, thinking about obviously the issues with maturation and growth from the boys' game. When you take that to the female game, that just it's another spanner thrown in the works, really, isn't it? To sort of consider. So it's probably a little bit more complicated taking it from the female game, from the boys' game to the female game.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, as I said, I think what we're just at the point now with the girls' game is starting to break the taboo where it's starting to get monitored and tracked in as part of the normal training load and wellness monitoring. And I think once we establish those as standard practices, then we can start to explore some of the relationships, for example, between when a player gets injured, can we also get more data on the menstrual cycle phase, etc. But I think we're just at the point of starting to really understand that from more of just an observational perspective at the moment, before we can actually start designing studies to look at specifically the phase of the menstrual cycle and training implications.
Yeah, good. Do any of the other panelists have any questions for Stacey?
Yeah, just one briefly, Stacey. You mentioned that the age groups are they jumped in 2-year increments as opposed to one in the boys' game. So you can have players almost 2 chronological years apart in the same category. Is there quite big jumps in how often they're training? I know you said that it's quite difficult to get data on training exposure, but even in the amount of sessions per week, is that jumping up quite a lot and does that advantage the older players in those age categories and maybe disadvantage the younger, or maybe is it the other way around? Are the older players in those categories not getting enough of a stimulus?
Yeah, so the under 10s and under 12s, they train twice a week, 2-hour sessions in a game. The 14s and 16s have an additional kind of third session. In terms of the challenge, particularly in that 12s to 14s, when we sort of just looked at the data, was a huge variability even within that one squad that you may have in maturity status. Yeah. So I think kind of the big challenge with that at where we were at with this research at the time was starting to educate coaches and stop comparing players directly in the age groups, because they were still at that point really of probably where football used to be in terms of a coach wanting the under 14s data and who's the fastest in the under 14s, who's the fittest, etc. So I think we were trying to just use this as an educational piece really with the coaches and trying to get them to understand the influence of maturity status on physical performance, but also understand the huge variability within their squad and getting them to sort of reflect and think about how they were viewing some of their players.
Yeah, and just in relation to that, you might not know, but what were the attitudes of coaches once they're becoming more educated? Are they quite open to things like biobanding? Did they kind of see that there might be benefit of that in the future, or have they not really expressed that so far?
Yeah, I think generally my interactions with coaches have been really positive. I think probably where the challenges at the moment is a lot of the coaches are going on their development courses and things like their youth mods, etc. And they're coming back and they've heard about biobanding and they've heard about other aspects and they've heard that maturation might impact performance and they've heard a relative age effect, etc. But a lot of what they're taking away from that is directly from youth male players. So some of those things, and it's not saying that everything's completely different, and there's practices such as biobanding which have been developed in the boys' game which directly can be implemented into the girls' game, but it's reflecting on some of those things where they're like, well, she's bigger and she looks old and she's older, so why isn't she athletically better than the younger ones, when actually in the girls we're sort of, because we see that increase in fat mass and some of those a decrease in relative strength, we actually sort of were seeing on the pitch a decrease in athleticism for that period of time. So from a coach's perspective, she couldn't really get around the pitch as much. She didn't seem as explosive anymore. So it was trying to educate them that actually those differences that occur around peak height velocity, etc., are slightly different in boys and girls, and that it's great they've got an awareness of it now, but just the acknowledgement that that might have slightly different implications for boys versus girls.
Yeah, no, perfect, thanks. It's really good.
Brilliant. Anyone else from the panel?
Hi Stacey, it's Ollie here, Ollie Morgan. I really liked your paper, Stacey, and it's something that we're looking to do up here at Celtic. Actually, there's not a lot of longitudinal based sort of studies looking at, I know sort of seasonal variations or anything longer, but just looking through some of the data there. In terms of body mass, depending on obviously age group, people or the girls were going up between sort of 2 and 3 kilos throughout the season. And there was an improvement in their peak force by 100 to 120 newtons, depending on group. And there was that small to moderate effect of relative peak force. I know you answered this in the actual paper when you spoke about not having a control group, but from an evaluating efficacy point of view, so from evaluating any S&C work that you're doing to suggest that the stimulus that they're providing is providing these or resulting in these improvements, what proportion of those improvements do you actually think are caused from just natural growth and maturation? I know that's kind of an impossible question to ask or to answer, but I'd just like to get your thoughts on that, really.
Yeah, I think, as you said, it was quite hard to kind of come up with a definitive answer, and I wasn't directly working within the girls' academy structure at that time at Leeds. I've only been there this season, but Matt's done some work, so Matt might want to jump in on that. That's looked at some 3-year progression in terms of delivery within the girls' academy, and I'll probably let Matt expand on his own work a bit more, but Matt showed that almost one S&C session delivered within those older age groups consistently throughout the season could potentially mitigate some of those decreases in performance. Now, I think potentially from my own perspective, that might align also with the low training age of some of those girls as well, and that actually, because a lot of them haven't had any exposure before, that actually a little bit makes quite a difference. That might differ as we progress, but I don't know if Matt wants to add to that.
Yeah, I'd agree. What we did, we tracked it in line with maturation and did a kind of within player correlation. What we didn't have, again, and it's always the problem, is trying to get a kind of an appropriate age match control group that you can compare against. So, and you're sort of making the assumption that you're going to get a plateau with the girls if they weren't doing anything, where obviously with boys it might be different. So there's an assumption there that if you do get that kind of linear trend, which we saw in speed related kind of physical qualities, speed, change of directional speed, things like that, but we didn't see in kind of aerobic capacity. So we're making an assumption that the training is perhaps affecting that, is having a beneficial effect, and it's not ideal, but it was the best thing we could do without that access to an appropriate control group. Yeah, definitely. I think, and Stacey, you touched on this in your paper in terms of maybe how much the sort of regional groups are really targeting these sort of parts of the long-term athlete development, particularly sort of strength and some of the other athletic parameters. But I guess if we can sort of turn around and say, well, there's been this improvement with maybe this sort of process, but actually compared to controls, it's not actually that much of an improvement. That's something that we're sort of looking to do here, really. So if we did see, say, a 20% improvement in some modality, we could say that, well, actually it could be 10% of that could well be growth and maturation, for example, and then it kind of just helps us to really evaluate what we're doing. But no, I just want to get your thoughts on it, really, and if you'd really looked into it any more at all. But thanks, Matt, for your answer there. That's gone some way to answer it for sure.
Yeah, it's something that we're looking to do as part of the PhD. So Jake's PhD only started in October. So I started some of the pilot work. He took that over in October when he started, and will actually start his first PhD study in the sort of the next season coming up, whenever that starts. But yeah, that is something we're looking to embed into his PhD.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
Brilliant. I've just got one question, Stacey, and it's probably to do with the MBI. What are the pros and cons of using MBI for some of the other people in attendance, really, that probably might be starting off the research career or anything like that, just to sort of give them that understanding? Because when I first read this study, I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting it when I read the statistics.
Yeah, so there's probably, as I said, this went out in 2018. So since then, there's probably been a lot of debate around null hypothesis testing and your standard p-values versus MBIs and the pros and cons of that. And there's a range of literature to kind of go and read around that. I think MBIs around this period of publishing this paper and doing this study were quite prevalent within the sports science literature. Some people are still using them now, some people have gone away from them. I think sort of the benefit or why people transition more to this approach is generally relates a lot to sample size. So in terms of why some studies may or may not have statistical significance in sports science, at times may relate to the sample size and the study not having enough power to reach significance. So it was kind of suggested MBI offers an approach where we can almost look at what is a meaningful change in performance, acknowledging having a smaller sample size allows us to have that look again at the confidence interval and what is maybe from a trivial to a most likely change. So there's pros and cons to both. I think some of the literature now is moving again away from MBIs as an approach, but at the time it was kind of quite a prevalent approach used in sports science. And I know from a practitioner perspective, there is still quite a lot of practitioners using it to evaluate what is actually a meaningful change in physical profiling. So, you know, if a player achieves a 10 meters time of, for example, 1.96 and then they got 1.94, is that actually a meaningful change in performance? So I think it offers something that's maybe easier for practitioners to embed in practice who maybe aren't as well comfortable with some of the more progressive sort of general linear mixed models, etc., that might be used in the literature.
Yeah, good. That's it from me. I think we're going to have to call it a close there, guys, because we've just gone over the 5 o'clock. We've been going for 2 hours, which is brilliant. It doesn't actually feel like we've been going for 2 hours, but thank you very much, Stacey. That was brilliant. And it's definitely really, really interesting to understand a lot more about the female game and how that sort of maturation process, especially in the youth academy, is really coming through and how much it's hopefully going to develop a lot more over the coming years. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Liam.
We was going to have a discussion point at this time, guys, but I think we've discussed so much on the actual papers themselves, we're probably going to leave it. So I'm going to give a thank you to everyone. First of all, to all the presenters today, Marcus, Elliot and Stacey. Also to all the people on the panel, Tom, David, Matt, Andy, who was with us but over my WhatsApp because he couldn't seem to log on to the panel, and Ollie as well. Ollie, you provided some really good discussion points. Thank you very much, mate. And then also to some of our partners who have really helped get this set up with a lot of advertisement, Football Fitness Federation, Basic Performance Podcast and Performance Scientist and Dave Carolan. They've been excellent in promoting the Sports Science Journal Club, trying to get people on and basically trying to generate knowledge and develop knowledge across the community, really. So, again, thank you very much. You should all receive a feedback request when you come off. First of all, I will apologise for the slight technical difficulties at the start. I don't know if everyone over experienced them, but I certainly did, so I'm assuming other people did too. Thank you very much, and tune in again next time. Thank you so much to all the presenters, and any questions, contact me and we'll try and contact them through it. Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Liam.
As well.
Cheers, Liam.
Thanks, Liam.
Top man,
Cheers.
Liam.
Thanks, Liam.
Thanks, mate.
Thanks.